Recently, Ronan Farrow uncovered more allegations against Harvey Weinstein. And of course, it involves sexual harassment, sexual assault, and in some cases, even rape. Now, it was a huge story that was recently published in The New Yorker. And now we're finding information based on employees that work on NBC that Ronan Farrow wasn't allowed to report that story or publish that story with NBC. In fact, there were executives that seemed to go out of their way to prevent publicizing that story. Now, let me give you the details on that. Now, Ronan had been told by executives at NBC News that he didn't have enough reporting to go on air with his Weinstein story, and that's according to 4 sources. And he had been told by the network to stop reporting on it. NBC tried to put a stop to the interview with the woman accusing Weinstein of rape. Now, if you guys have read Ronan Farrow's piece in The New Yorker, you'll know that there is a ton of detailed information there. It's like a 10-page piece with so many different details, so many different people that he interviewed and some who even spoke on record. So it's not all anonymous sources. And also his piece was the one that released the audio featuring the Filipina actress Gutierrez and the sting operation that was done on Weinstein through the NYPD. So that was all stuff that for some reason NBC decided did not want to cover. Now, Ronan Farrow wound up paying out of his own pocket for a camera crew to film an interview. Also keep in mind that by April of this year, NBC News had 2 big scoops in its pocket: an on-record interview with Rose McGowan, and an explosive audio of Weinstein admitting to sexual assault. But Farrow was told by multiple NBC News executives and producers that the reporting and interviews he had conducted weren't sufficient for a televised story.
Okay, so first of all, is it possible that your reporting would pass muster at one place, but not necessarily another? And the place that it doesn't pass muster doesn't mean that they're better journalists. It just might be different standards, et cetera. So just because the story didn't run doesn't mean that by definition it was true and there was a cover up. And sometimes they're right not to run a story because you just didn't have enough evidence and you don't want to make those charges without it. This is not one of those times.
This is not one of those times, no.
So first off, Yashar Ali and Lydia Palgreen, who reported this for the Huffington Post, they themselves talked to 12 people inside and outside of NBC News. So their reporting on what happened internally is pretty rock solid. And when you look at that reporting, it's not pretty. So Anna's right that by April they had 2 giant scoops. Either one of those, if confirmed, would have been enough to run on their own. I mean, the audio tape that we ran for you guys yesterday that Ronan Farrow got in the first place of Weinstein trying to bring a woman into his hotel room and in the most creepy way, and he admits that he did grope her the day before. That's sexual assault, and he admitted on tape.
That's right.
That's amazing. Of course you could run that story. Of course you can, right? Because you know that that's the tape. You had Rose McGowan, a very famous actress and now director as well, saying it on tape. Are you crazy? You're not gonna run that? So, I mean, if it was just one person's accusation, but you had so much more than that. And by July, he had on-camera interviews, Ronan Farrow did, on-camera interviews with accusers and interviews with 4 female and male former Miramax and Weinstein Company executives. That's a bombshell, man.
Yeah.
And it's corroborated in 18 different ways. Eventually, the New Yorker that did run it for Ronan Farrow said it exemplified great investigative journalism.
Yeah, it was one of the most detailed investigative reports I've ever read, and it was impressive to say the least. Now, what was also interesting was that this particular story required much more scrutiny within NBC News or NBC than any other reporting or any other story needed. So for instance, the story needed to be approved by executives who previously wouldn't have to approve any stories to begin with, including Andy Lack, who is the NBC News chairman, and Steve Burke. That's the Comcast VP executive and also the NBCUniversal CEO, or NBCUniversal CEO. So all of a sudden there's this extra layer of scrutiny, and I want to be clear about something else. Remember, this whole story involving Weinstein first broke last week with the New York Times piece. And following the New York Times piece, ABC, CBS, major news networks covered it. But NBC didn't.
So it gets slightly worse. So first off, it's not crazy for a news story to go all the way to the top of the news chain, which is Andy Lack at NBC News. But if it was a story about someone who had no power and you already had half a dozen sources, you had people on tape, you had a tape that came from the NYPD to begin with, and you've got to corroborate it up and down, you wouldn't bother bringing it to Andy Lack. Why would you bring it to the very top of the news chain? You only have to do that if it's someone really, really powerful. And you go, look, I got to cover my ass. I'm going to bring this all the way up to Andy Lack. And now, but under no circumstances does it make sense to bring it to the CEO. Well, I shouldn't say under no circumstances, but it makes you go, on a company as large as NBCUniversal, as large as Comcast, with God knows how many employees, to bring it to a non-news person, you're obviously making a business decision there.
That's right, that's right.
So, and then they killed it. And by the way, it's not the only time NBC News has killed a giant story about sexual assault. They had the original grab him by the pussy tape of Donald Trump with Access Hollywood. They had it and they wouldn't run it. The Washington Post eventually ran it. So that's two different times, really powerful guys who did sexual harassment that NBC News spiked. Oh, that's devastating. Now, one more thing, NBC News President Noah Oppenheim gave this hilarious quote, which they always say, like, well, I would never, said the notion that we would try to cover for a powerful person is deeply offensive to all of us.
Okay, I actually would like to read another one of Oppenheim's quotes that I thought was super interesting. Let's go to graphic 8. According to Huffington Post reporting on this, two sources familiar with the production told Huffington Post that Oppenheim made the final decision not to include a Weinstein story in the broadcast, telling staff that Weinstein wasn't a nationally recognizable figure.
We're done with that, okay? So that is a preposterous claim. You didn't run it up to the head of news and you didn't run it up to the CEO because he's not a nationally recognized figure. You ran it up to them because he is a nationally recognized figure. We're having a debate about that. The guy commits sexual harassment. It is news 24/7 for the last week. If he wasn't a nationally recognized figure and he was like some random teacher somewhere, you think the story was, I mean, that is a preposterous claim. So when you make that claim, we realize what your intent was. Your intent was, I don't want to upset the powerful, which by the way is NBC 101.
Wow, it's just so pathetic and so embarrassing.
Yeah, and look, they do this at MSNBC with the Democratic Party. Don't upset people in power. And then when Trump comes into office, what do? They hired half a dozen right-wing hosts immediately. Don't upset people in power. So if NBC does anything at all, it is to not upset people in power. So Oppenheim's quote there is the most ironic, hilarious, and hypocritical quote I've ever seen in news. So just own up to what happened here, and it ain't pretty. TYT membership gets you commercial-free Young Turks. Download it, stream it, podcast it, get all the network shows, and support independent media. TYTnetwork.com/join.